The chair now recognizes Ms. Crockett from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Too often when I sit in this room listening to my colleagues on the right, I ask myself, why are we having this hearing? But today is a little different, or is it? I applaud my Republican colleagues for conducting this hearing because GAO reports highlight the reasons why we cannot and should not pass the GOP's budget bill this week. You see, my colleagues on the right want their cake and they want to eat it too. I call it hypocrisy and hype. They want to use this committee as an arm of the RNC for 2024, but they don't want to provide the American people with the actual substantive solutions. They want to point out issues in the federal government, but they don't want to give the resources to fix the problems of the American people. So let's take a look at one issue that I know my constituents care about: taxes and getting their tax refunds. I'm not even going to say tax returns. They want their refunds. Like my constituents in Texas 30 last week, I had to file my tax returns with the IRS, and like them, I want to make sure that I get my money, which ain't really anyway. But according to the GAO report that is the focus of today's hearing, the IRS, quote, needs to increase its capacity to implement new initiatives, improve ongoing enforcement and taxpayer service programs, and combat identity theft and refund fraud, unquote. I have no doubt federal employees at the IRS work hard to ensure Americans' tax refunds go into the right hands. How do I know this? Because my mom is one of those federal employees that works for the IRS. And honestly, she's the hardest working woman that I know. But even with this GAO high-risk report that one of my colleagues wanted to have a hearing on today cites that the primary reason for declines in audit rates and roughly $50 million to $250 million in payments by the government to fraudulent tax returns is because of reduced staffing due to decreased funding, because last time I checked, ain't nobody trying to work for free. So how would my Republican colleagues plan to fix this? Well, just this past January, they voted to defund the IRS even more, slashing $80 billion under the Inflation Reduction Act passed by Democrats last Congress. And now Republicans are using the GOP budget bill to cut this $80 billion to the IRS. On top of how ridiculous this solution is, I'm not even surprised that the CBO projected that in cutting this funding, the Republican budget bill would add $114 billion to the national deficit. Simply put, if Republicans really cared about fiscal responsibility and protecting American taxpayer dollars, they would put their money where their mouth is. But as we know, their budget bill represents their priorities, and it's clear that their priorities are to protect wealthy tax cheats instead of throwing the federal hammer down on them. At the end of the day, I am here to do a job, and that's to protect my constituents. So I'd like to close out by asking our witnesses the following questions. Mr. Dodaro, what steps must Congress take to combat identity theft and fraud through the IRS and improve agency efficiencies so that people can get their refunds?
We have a number of recommendations for that Congress in that area. One would be to require additional electronic filing. Rather than have the paper returns keyed in, that's an inefficient process and induces errors into the process. I'll ask Mr. McTighe to elaborate a little bit further, but one additional thing is to give IRS the authority to set requirements for paid tax preparers. Many of the unenrolled paid tax preparers actually have greater error rates than people preparing their own taxes. So I think it would be provided better oversight over that area, and to also require more third-party information reporting so IRS could match against the records. That would provide more accurate and timely responses. Jay, would you have any additions?
Those are the key ones. I guess the one additional comment I would make, Congress could provide IRS with greater authority to correct simple math errors where taxpayers have inadvertently made errors. Information differs from what IRS or the government has in its databases. And that would not only help in terms of IRS's administration, but it also would reduce the burden on taxpayers to address those errors through correspondence and back and forth with the IRS. Obviously, taxpayers need to have protections and the ability to interact with IRS too.
I understand. Thank you so much. And you would agree that IRS needs resources to be able to carry out these plans, correct?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I was just saying you would agree with me that the IRS does need resources in order to effectuate these plans, correct?
GAO has long pointed out that, IRS does receive considerable resources, and it's imperative that they use the resources that they have most efficiently and effectively. But that can only go so far, particularly with the growth in the economy and the growth in the number of taxpayers.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair.